For more than a century after America's founding, nobody thought the First Amendment meant kicking God out of the classroom or public squares. Presidents, from Washington to Lincoln, openly called for prayer and thanksgiving. Congress hired chaplains. Schools used the Bible as a primary text to teach reading and morality. But in the mid-20th century, a radical interpretation of the First Amendment turned all that upside down. Judges, many appointed by progressive presidents, lefties, decided the Establishment Clause meant public faith had to disappear. And that's where the myth of separation in church and state as a weapon against religion really began. Welcome to our republic.
When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political band,
sailors and airmen of the Allied Expeditionary Force.
Well, I think it's time we ask ourselves if we still know the freedoms that were intended for us by the founding fathers. Not one small step for man.
Those three hallowed words reverently dictate what you ought to be, what you can be, what you will be.
we pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor.
So how were our freedoms torn down? We're going to go through a couple cases to show how progressive judges tore down and ripped God out of our public spaces. And then we're going to talk about how that's shifted back the other way, back towards what the founding fathers originally intended. So, 1962, Engel versus Vitale. The case, the court struck down a voluntary state-written prayer in New York schools. The prayer was generic, not denominational, and participation wasn't forced. But the court said that it was unconstitutional. So who said it? The opinion was written by Justice Hugo Black, appointed by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Democrat, former Alabama senator with New Deal leanings. Majority included justices like Earl Warren, Chief Justice appointed by Eisenhower, but became the darling of liberal activism, and William Douglas, FDR appointee, far left on the court. And what was its impact? Overnight, prayer that had been common for centuries was pushed out of schools, not by voters or Congress, but by lefty judges. 1963, Abington School District versus Sept. Pennsylvania required daily Bible readings. The court struck it down, said even non-denominational Bible readings were unconstitutional. Who did it? Majority opinion was written by Justice Tom C. Clark, appointed by Harry Truman, the Democrat. Joined by liberal justices William Brennan, appointed by Eisenhower, one of the court's most progressive voices. What was its impact? 2 centuries of schools using scripture for moral formation ended in one sweep. Then you've got 1980, Stone versus Graham. Kentucky law required the 10 Commandments posted in classrooms. The court tossed it, saying it's a violation of the Establishment Clause. So the ruling was a per curiam, which means it was unassigned. But the lineup again reflected that the liberal majority, Warren and Burger courts, hostility towards public faith. It was strongly influenced by precedents built in the Engel and Sept cases, and its impact for the first time in U.S. history, the nation's oldest moral code was declared off limits in school. But they built that wall, and cracks started to form, and faith started making a comeback. And in 2007, Bible literacy cases started coming up. For decades, schools avoided the Bible like it was radioactive. But around 2007, states started pushing back. Lawmakers argued the Bible isn't just a religious book, it's a foundation text for Western history, literature, and law. You can't study Shakespeare, the Declaration of Independence, or even Martin Luther King without understanding biblical references. So states like Texas, Georgia, and Oklahoma passed laws allowing schools to offer Bible literacy electives. These classes didn't preach or evangelize. They examined the Bible as literature and history. Students learned how these stories, language, and the moral codes shaped American culture. By now, there's at least 8 states explicitly allowing these courses, and more have bills in the works. More states have bills in the works. It marked the first official re-entry of the Bible into the classroom since the 1960s rulings by lefties drove it out. Now, the First Amendment Establishment Clause forbids government-sponsored religion, but it does not forbid teaching religion objectively. The ruling principle is neutrality. As long as the course didn't preach or force belief, it's legal. And the impact, states like Texas, Georgia, and Oklahoma passed laws allowing Bible literacy electives. The courts didn't strike them down because they were taught academically, not devotionally. And here's where it starts picking up speed. In 1917, Trinity Lutheran versus Comer. Missouri had a program that gave grants to nonprofits to resurface playgrounds with safer materials. Trinity Lutheran, which ran a preschool, applied, but the state denied them solely because they were a religious organization. The majority opinion came from Chief Justice John Roberts. In the ruling, the court said it was blatant discrimination. Roberts wrote, "The exclusion of Trinity Lutheran from public benefit for which it is otherwise qualified solely because it's a church is odious to our Constitution." The key principle, the free exercise clause. The state cannot withhold a public benefit just because the application is religious. Now, of course, there was dissent from Sonia Sotomayor, right? Joined by Justice Ginsburg's, argued that taxpayer money should never directly fund a church, even for something like playground resurfacing. Blah, 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 blah. The impact. This was the first major crack. Religious organizations can't be treated as second-class citizens when applying for neutral government benefits. And then these two, Espinoza versus the Montana Department of Revenue. Montana created a scholarship program that let parents use tax credit-funded vouchers for private schools. But the state barred religious schools from participating. So the parents sued. And the case went all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the majority opinion, again, was written by Justice Roberts. It says the case, right? Montana created a scholarship program for private schools, but banned religious schools from receiving funding. The court struck down the exclusion, and Roberts wrote, "A state need not subsidize private education. But once a state decides to do so, it cannot disqualify some private schools solely because they are religious." The key principle was the religious neutrality. Once aid is available, you cannot exclude families who choose religious options. And of course, there's dissent from Stephen Breyer, who argued the ruling went too far in forcing states to fund religious schools, saying it blurred the line between church and state. Obviously, this retard didn't understand the Constitution and what Jefferson had said. So what was the impact? Parents with vouchers could choose Christian schools without state interference, which was a huge win for school choice and religious liberty. And this was a big one. 2022, Kennedy versus Bremerton School District. Coach Joe Kennedy, a Marine veteran who turned high school football coach, had a tradition. After games, he knelt at the 50-yard line and prayed briefly, sometimes joined by players. The school district told him to stop, fearing lawsuits because they're feckless cowards. And he refused to do because he's got balls, and he was fired. The majority opinion was Justice Neil Gorsuch. The case, again, Joe Kennedy was fired for kneeling in prayer at the 50-yard line after games. What a bunch of frickin' cowards, man. Here's the ruling. The court sided with Kennedy, and Gorsuch wrote, "The Constitution neither mandates nor tolerates that kind of discrimination. Against religious expression, the prayer was deemed private, personal, and protected under free speech and the free exercise clause. You idiots." The key principle, the court rejected the old Lemon test from Lemon versus Kurtzman in 1971, which has been used for decades to strike down religious activity in public settings. Instead, this was the huge open door. The court said the Establishment Clause must be interpreted through America's history and tradition, not religious hostility to faith. That was huge. So now all these cases will now go in and be interpreted through what our founding fathers did. And if you don't know what they did, go watch the last episode. I talk about it in that last episode about what separation in church and state. Just people are dumb. Anyway, this is huge. And of course, Sonia Sotomayor warned the ruling blurred church and state lines, showing a photo of Kennedy surrounded by players to argue prayer wasn't purely private. She's going to answer before God for this, man. It just makes me sick. The impact, it was massive. It reversed 60 years of precedent and restored protections for public prayer. And in 2023, Bibles and the Ten Commandments returned. And if you want to know a little bit more about this, you can go look up Dave Barton and his team at Wall Builders. They are doing a lot of work in this area of removing this stupid separation in church and state garbage. I love those guys. They're incredible. The most recent push has come from state legislators themselves. Okay, this is still in progress, right? And it's at the state level, but for example, right, Texas passed SB 1515 in 2023, requiring the 10 Commandments to be displayed in every classroom. Similar bills in other states allowed or required prayer movements, Bible reading, and explicit protections for student Bible clubs. The legal justification, these laws are now backed by Kennedy versus Bremerton. Legislators argued that since the court said faith in public spaces is protected, states can now allow moral and religious heritage back in schools. And I love it. Right? The challenge is lawsuits are already being filed by groups like the ACLU, bunch of clowns, who argue they still violate the Establishment Clause. Obviously, these people have no clue what the Constitution actually says. But after Kennedy, the legal landscape has shifted heavily in favor of religious expression, right? And that's the impact, right? The pendulum has swung. Where Engel in 1962 banned prayer from some lefty lunatic, Kennedy in 2022, new state laws are bringing it back. The First Amendment was never meant to banish God from American life. It was written to stop the government from picking one official church and forcing everyone into it, like in China. The founders prayed openly, read scriptures publicly, and saw faith as essential to liberty. And it was activist moron judges in the mid-20th century, many appointed by progressive presidents who twisted the separation of church and state into a weapon against religion. But that tide is shifting. From Bible literacy classes to Coach Kennedy on the 50-yard line, the courts are slowly walking back those decades of hostility. I freaking love it because we are where we are as a nation because they did that. Now, thank you for listening and hearing me ramble and rant. I'm a little tired this morning, so I might be a little grumpy, a little fired up, but whatever. Just remember, history isn't boring, especially when the same Supreme Court, a nation that kicked prayer out of schools and tried to exile God from the classroom in the mid-60s, is now cracking the door wide open for prayer and Bibles to return to school. And they're watching and having God walk right back in to public life in schools. See you next time.